The FIFA World Cup in Qatar kicks off in just over 3 weeks. And as the tournament approaches, there have been growing concerns and outcries over the host nation's human rights record. Canada Soccer was facing pressure to speak out, and now the organization has done so by adding its voice to calls for change. Qatar has been under fire for its treatment of migrant workers, many of whom built the tournament's stadiums and facilities. There are also concerns over potential threats to LGBTQ fans in a country where same-sex relations are illegal. Natalie Kalata has been following the details for us. Natalie.
That's right, Natasha. We know that Qatar has been facing quite a lot of criticism, particularly over the last decade or so, for its human rights record, but also for the treatment of these migrant workers, many of whom, and most of whom I should say, were from South Asia. So these are workers who were needed to build the stadiums for the big soccer tournament, the transportation, as well as the hotels for the event. And Amnesty International Canada's Secretary General highlighted some of the issues in a recent interview. Kati Nivabandi outlined the conditions that many of these migrant workers were facing, and she described that. Have a listen to what she had to say.
Many of them working with 14 to 18 hours a day, often without a rest day. Some of the security guards who are working on site, we know, have been denied the opportunity to rest, and are really detained in appalling conditions. So that is really our great concern, that the World Cup is happening on the back and at the expense of the rights of migrant workers in Qatar.
Now, in a poll the organization did last year, they reached out to soccer fans around the world, and they found that about 3/4 say that FIFA should be compensating the families of these workers, particularly those who died in the years prior to the World Cup. And 2/3 want their national football teams to speak up. And that is now what we are seeing from Canada Soccer. In a statement, the organization calls for further progress of workers' rights and inclusivity, adding, while strides have been made in strengthening protections for workers through the Qatar's government's labor reforms, we encourage all partners to continue the dialogue, ensuring these reforms translate to tangible improvements in protections for workers' rights and inclusivity across the country beyond the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022. Now, Soccer Canada has said, Canada Soccer did add that not only did they make the decision to make this statement, but they are partnering with local vendors who, Natasha, they say, align with their principles and values, and that mainly surrounding things like accommodation. Natasha?
Okay, thanks so much, Nat. Canada Soccer is adding its voice to the outcry over Qatar's human rights record. This is as the FIFA World Cup is gearing up to kick off in just over 3 weeks. So let's take a closer look at the story with Mustafa Qadri. He's a research fellow at the Institute for Human Rights and Business and has researched this issue of treatment of migrant workers in Qatar extensively. Mustafa, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you, Natasha, for having me over.
Mustafa, before we dive into the research, the extensive research you've done, I'd like to get your reaction to Canadian soccer players, Australian soccer players now raising concerns about human rights concerns in Qatar. Is it too little too late?
Well, I've been monitoring Qatar from the very moment that it won the rights to have the tournament. Certainly, we have only weeks left after 12 years. But I think it's not too late. I think that something can be done, and there's no question the global world knows Qatar held this tournament to build up its public relations. Well, the image of Qatar is one of risks of modern slavery and other human rights concerns. So there's a chance now to put a lot of pressure on a country where traditionally doesn't have many pressure points.
So let's dive into that a bit more, because for the purposes of this interview, let's really talk about those migrant workers, hundreds and hundreds of people who've gone to the country to help build the stadiums and the infrastructure and the facilities. What did you find? What were the conditions they were working under?
Sure, yeah. So to give you a sense of Qatar, it's quite a small place. It's basically a peninsula just below Iran. It's a very gas-rich country, population of roughly 3 million. Incredibly, 90% of its population are low-wage workers from Africa and Asia. I've been going to Qatar now for about 10 years. I've personally spoken to thousands of workers. I now run an organization, Equidem, where we have quite a big research team in Qatar. They're all migrant workers themselves. And that gives us unique access to what workers are really facing. Now, about 40,000 workers have been involved in building the 8 stadiums, modern stadiums, that will host the World Cup. These are workers that have worked in extreme heat conditions, which we know scientifically puts a huge risk of death and organ damage, but also they face what we call modern slavery indicator practices. What does that mean? It means that when you're looking for a job, you incredibly get charged often thousands of dollars in a fee, which puts you in debt. When you come to Qatar, your job is nowhere near what was promised to you in terms of pay and conditions. You often don't get paid on time. And then, of course, you face harassment, physical, verbal, and other ways on these building sites. Life is really difficult for these workers. Now, remember that at these stadiums, because it's being held in the Gulf, they're putting air conditioning so that fans and soccer players don't get too hot. These workers got none of those luxuries. They're working in that heat. They're far from their families. They're financially in incredible desperation. And our research shows that what also companies have been doing is very aggressively trying to evade any kind of labor protection. So not only are workers facing these modern slavery practices, but the companies are actually getting away with treating them in this way. So really, we're looking at this situation where a World Cup is being built on the back of modern slavery. Now, in terms of what it's like to be a worker, it's obviously very hard in a short time frame to really paint that picture for you. But we're talking about workers that come from, some really rich societies in terms of culture, from Africa and Asia, places like Nepal, Kenya, Bangladesh. When they go to Qatar, it is a desert country. It's not the shiny, beaming shopping centers and those nice hotels that you might see as a tourist. This is camps that are very basic, often, very poor conditions, far away from those areas. They're often working and living in very crowded accommodation with complete strangers, far away from their families. And of course, they face discrimination. They're not treated as equals in terms of the social conditions of that society. So it's a very dislocating environment. And then on top of that, of course, there is the exploitation and the lack of pay. Now, I think of myself, I'm a very privileged person, but if I wasn't paid my salary for 1 month, if I had a huge debt on my back just to find a job in the hope of getting my life better, it's not just the financial ruin, I'd be psychologically ruined. And that's what we find with these workers. They're normal people like us. They might have a different background to your viewers, but they just want to have a good life for themselves and hopefully that their children don't have to struggle the way that they have. And yet we have billions of dollars being poured into this tournament, and incredibly workers not only aren't making enough money, they're actually in debt. They've actually lost
Mustafa,
money.
I have to jump in because there's so much more we need to cover and I don't want us to run out of time. So specifically, what can be done? Because we know that when inspectors in various organizations came in to see the working conditions, they would quickly get cleaned up. Your research indicated that many of the workers would be put on buses to get far away from the inspectors so that the inspectors couldn't interview the workers. So now the games are on and the players are going and the world is watching. What can we all do now?
So it's a really key question. So I've worked in lots of countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, civil war. I've worked with Aboriginal communities in Australia, where I'm originally from. In Qatar, as harrowing as the situation is, there's something that can be done. It really is as simple as making sure workers get compensated for wages that are owed or for injuries and other forms of harm, and that workers have a space in Qatar, a safe space called the Migrant Worker Centre that's independent, run by workers. How do we support that? Well, we have to put pressure on our soccer teams, on our sponsors, people like the big ones, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, you name it. They're all involved in this World Cup to say that we demand that you support these actions and you demand Qatar and FIFA compensate these workers and set up a migrant worker center. You can put the pressure because ultimately Qatar, this is not a democracy. It's not a society that generally is swayed by public pressure. But World Cup, the Soccer World Cup, is the biggest prize in international sport. And so it is this one opportunity that we have. Equidem as well, you can support us. We, with our worker teams, are tracking down the thousands of workers who are owed compensation and putting all those cases in front of FIFA, in front of Qatar to say, here is the evidence. These are people that under your own law should be paid. We're not talking here about bringing democracy to Qatar. We're not talking about radical change. We're talking about you respecting your own law, the basic rights. People need to support that in Canada. And anyone who loves soccer around the world, put pressure on your football teams as well.
Okay. Mustafa Qadri, thank you so much for your time and for your insights, sir.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.